O Mahamedi, adorned with upaya, he will visit all the Buddha lands. And disengaged from the philosophical doctrines as well as from the Siddha, Manas, and Vijnana, he will experience a revulsion within himself and by degrees will attain the Tathagata body. Therefore, O Mahamedi, if a bodhisattva wishes to attain the Tathagata body, he should keep himself away from the skandhas, datas, ayatanas, siddham, causation, works, discipline, birth, staying and passing, and cease from discriminating, philosophizing, and abide in the thought of the mind only. When the triple world is surveyed by the bodhisattva, he perceives that this existence is due to memory that has been accumulated since the beginningless past but wrongly interpreted. He recognizes that Buddhahood is a state imageless, unborn, and to be inwardly experienced by oneself, when the mind becomes fully controlled and purposeless deeds are accomplished. Like the Sintamatu, he will now manifest himself in a variety of forms according to the needs of sentient beings and lead them to the view that only mind is, and then gradually compel them to ascend the stages. Therefore, O Mahamedi, let the Bodhisattva discipline himself well in the work of self-realization. Being full of technical terms, the reader may find the import of the passage here quoted difficult to understand, but as we go on, it will, I hope, grow fully intelligible. In the meantime, the following paraphrase will help the reader to get a general idea of it. The highest stage of Buddhist experience is reached when a man comes to realize that things are devoid of a self-substance, or that they are not after all final, irreducible realities, for they never have been created, they are what they are from beginningless past. If we say that they have come into existence, or that they exist as we perceive them through the senses, this will imply that individualization is ultimate fact, which, however, is contrary to the truth inwardly perceived by an enlightened mind. Individualization is due to discrimination, which is falsely interpreted and adhered to by a heart blinded by desires and passions, and from this fact there issue all kinds of human tragedies and comedies. What really exists is mind, which is above all discrimination, that is, above logic and analysis. When this mind, which is designated in the sutra as the Alaya or Alayavijnana, is discriminated by an erroneously self-created and self-reflecting agent called manas, this world of particulars develops in its misleading fullness and richness. Discrimination is the result of memory accumulated from the unknown past. Vasana literally means perfuming, or fumigation, that is, it is a kind of energy that is left behind when an act is accomplished and has the power to rekindle the old and seek out new impressions. Through this perfuming, reflection takes place, which is the same thing as discrimination, and we have a world of opposites and contraries with all its practical consequences. The triple world, so called, is therefore the shadow of a self-reflecting and self-creating mind. Hence the doctrine of mind only. Reality as it is, or mind in itself, is also called the suchness or sameness of things, as herein are unified all forms of antithesis which constitute our actual world of sense and logic. The Bodhisattva abides in this suchness which transcends all our reasonings and discriminations. And because he abides in this transcendental realm, his all-loving heart works without the taint of selfishness and one-sided attachment, using all contrivances whereby to save his fellow beings from pain and suffering. These works of his are called purposeless for the reason that they are not actuated by any egotistic interests or desires or motives. They are called out from the abundance of his inner goodness, which now shines forth free from all defilements of intellection as well as of conation. The world is like Maya, or mirage. As his intellect is no longer snared in the meshes of dualistic logic, he intuitively perceives that the world of particularization is no more than the reflection of his own mind. His life is thus designated as formless or imageless and his deeds effortless and purposeless. Yet he never relaxes his efforts to benefit all sentient beings. He knows from his transcendental position that samsara and nirvana are the same. And yet he knows not when to stop working for the realization of the highest ideals and also for universal salvation. His inner mind is then said to be abiding in the samadhi known as mayopama, mirage-like. This seems to be the highest state of spiritual attainment realizable by a mind encased in a human body. But there is still a higher state to be attained by the Buddhist. There is a higher body called Buddhikaya which is obtained when a man enters upon Vajravimbappama Samadhi. When this is obtained, one is endowed with the 10 powers, the 6 psychic faculties, and the 10-fold self-mastery. He is then able to transform himself into various forms in order to benefit sentient beings accordance with their desires and circumstances. He is also able to visit all the Buddha lands and to perform all Buddha deeds. The main object of the Buddhist life is thus seen to consist in having a certain spiritual revulsion, whereby we are able to leap from the dualistic shore of this individualistic world to the other shore of Nirvana, where there are no egoistic impulses and desires in evidence any longer, though this means not at all the death of a loving heart itself. To effect this revulsion, spiritual discipline is needed which finally leads up to a certain exalted inner condition. Enlightenment, self-realization, or the opening of an inner eye is the name given to it. The Lankavatara calls it Pratyatmarjana Nagokara, or Svasiddhanta, and the main object of its teaching is to acquaint us with the fact of an inner perception which causes a spiritual revolution in our whole life. The reason why the Lankavatara is considered to be historically and doctrinally so closely related to Zen Buddhism is based on this fact that herein most emphatically asserted is the importance of an inner realization as the source of all the religious virtues and blessings. Zen, of all the schools of Buddhism, is preeminently the religion of enlightenment. If the Buddhist life is to be regarded as consisting of prajna or bodhi, and karuna, Zen indeed makes most of the prajna element at least during its first stages of training, and this prajna which it teaches is to be attained by transcending the relativity of worldly knowledge, which will free our desires and passions from the entanglements of the individualistic world conception. It does not teach to destroy all the impulses, instincts, and affective factors that make up the human heart. It only teaches to clear up our intellectual insight from erroneous discriminations and unjustifiable assertions. For when this is done, the heart knows by itself how to work out its native virtues. This is the position of Zen Buddhism. And in the following pages I wish to develop what the Lankavatara states on this subject. Rather generally in the first part concerning the nature of the inner realization, and in the second and the third art concerning its relations to logic, psychology, and the practical life. The all-importance of an inner realization. The ideas that things are devoid of self-substance. That is, they are by nature empty. That the world is nothing but mind. That in order to reach the ultimate end of Buddhahood one must transcend all the limitations of dualism and particularization. And finally that the state of enlightenment must be realized within one's self. These are the common property of Mahayana Buddhism. But in the Lankavatara these ideas are developed in a way peculiar to this sutra. By this I mean that it lays a special emphasis on the importance of self-realization, without which the Buddhist life remains a mere philosophical exercise. The reason why Bodhidharma handed this sutra over to Huike as containing the essence of Zen Buddhism must be sought in this, that the constant refrain of the Lankavatara is the all-importance of an inner perception or self-realization. Therefore, the purpose of this sutra is highly practical in spite of its abstract speculations. LN the first chapter, which is added to the 2 later translations of the Lankavatara, we have this from the Buddha, who gently smiled looking at the palace of Lanka on Mount Malaya. All the Buddhas of the past have discoursed on the truth of an inner realization which can be attained only by the supreme wisdom of the Buddha and never by the speculation of the philosophers, or by the discipline of the Sravaka and Pratyeka Buddha. This truth I will now disclose for the benefit of Ravana, king of Leka. And when the Bodhisattva Mahamedi finished praising the virtues of the Buddha in the beginning of chapter 2, which is chapter I of the Sung translation, the Buddha surveying the assembly made this remark: O yet, sons of the victorious one, and O thou, Mahamedi, ask and I will instruct you concerning the attainment of the inmost realization. These statements are conclusive as showing that Lankavatara's special importance in the literature of Mahayana Buddhism lies in its perpetual upholding of this intuitive element in all religion. While the sutra has been made use of to support the claims of a particular school such as the Yogacara or the Avatamsaka, in its connection with the doctrine of the Alayavijnana or Tathagata Garbha, this connection is accidental. The thesis of the sutra must be regarded as centered upon the idea of an inner perception of the deepest truth, which goes beyond language and reasoning. The Buddhist discipline or exercise as is told by the Buddha consists of two parts, philosophical and practical. The philosophical discipline is to train the mind to absolute idealism and see that the world is mind, and that there is in reality no becoming such as birth and death, and that no external things really exist. While the practical side is to attain an inner perception by means of supreme wisdom. Putting the practical side of Buddhist discipline first, we can say that when it is accomplished, the philosophical side follows by itself. That is to say, the world as seen in the light of self-realization is to be interpreted in terms of absolute idealism. However this may be, the Lankavatara is decidedly rich in deep mystical speculations. One thing I wish to notice in the Lankavatara before I proceed to describe the nature of the inner realization is that this sutra does not make one reference to the awakening of the thought of enlightenment made so much of, especially in the sutras of the Prajnaparamita group. The awakening of the thought of enlightenment means to take interest in the teaching of Mahayana Buddhism and to wish sincerely for the realization of its truth. This is really the first step in the career of a bodhisattva, for without this awakening no further progress in spiritual discipline will be possible. Therefore, in almost all the Mahayana sutras one is told to direct one's first thought toward enlightenment. When this is accomplished, one must come some day to the final attainment, however remote that day may be. In the Lankavatara no word is said about the awakening. But it goes directly to the heart of the matter, that is, it asks the bodhisattva to come to the realization at once, instead of making gradual advance toward the goal. In this respect, this sutra may be said to be an appeal to those bodhisattvas who are already deeply steeped in the Mahayana teaching of supreme enlightenment. Another thing that the student of the Lankavatara notices is that the Buddha here tells Mahamati to attain to a state of inner realization and not of enlightenment. These two are psychologically the same process. When one has pratyatmajnana, one is enlightened. But in the Lankavatara the ultimate goal of the Buddhist life is generally stated in terms of experience and not intellectually as illumining. I am inclined to think that the Lankavatara is unique in this respect, explaining perhaps the reason why Bodhidharma, the father of Zen Buddhism in China, recommended it to his mystic followers. When the Lankavatara refers to Gokara or Gatagokara, instead of to Bodhi or Sambadhi, we realize that the main object of the sutra centers on the acquirement and cultivation of a certain general subjective attitude towards the world and life, which is not merely philosophical or conceptual, but which comes from the experience of some definite turning in the activity of the mind. Sambadhi or enlightenment looks more toward the cognitive aspect of the revulsion one experiences. This is all well as far as it goes, which is indeed the basis of all Buddhism, be it Hinayana or Mahayana. The Lankavatara, however, has come to see that the whole of the Buddhist life is not in merely seeing into the truth, but in living it, experiencing it, so that there will be no dualism in one's life of seeing and living. Seeing must be living, and living seeing, with no hiatus between them, except in language. Hence the Lankavatara's reference so much to living or experience, Gokara or Gatagokara, that is, Pratyatmagokara. The inner experience and language. This inner perception or realization is made possible by the presence of the Tathagata Garbha within the heart of every sentient being. 1 The Garbha, which literally means womb, or better, something interiorly hidden, is the seed of Tathagatahood from which a fully enlightened being grows up. This, however, is generally found covered up with defiled wrappings of false judgment and irrational attachment. False judgment comes from not perceiving things as they are, that is, as not subject to the principle of individuation, which is imposed by the mind upon things considered externa. As to the irrational attachment which causes in us all kinds of vexation, it is the inevitable result of false judgment. The Garbha, therefore, originally pure and immaculate, must be restored to its natural state free from attachments. It is thus generally likened to a priceless gem concealed under a soiled garment. Take the garment off and the shining stone will begin to shed its natural light over things as they are. The illumination thus obtained is a state of self-realization, and one can then see the garbha as if held in one's own hand, even as plainly as the amulika fruit. As the garbha thus cleansed of its defilement is beyond the speculations of the philosophers and the attainment of the Hinayanists. The author of the Dasabhumika as well as the Lankavatara calls it a Vikalpa, or Nirvikalpajnana, meaning knowledge of non-judgment or non-discrimination, a kind of direct percept on, or again knowledge of thusness or suchness. In spite of the practical end it has in view. The Lankavatara is filled with abstract nomenclature, which sometimes turns away those unfamiliar with Buddhist literature from further pursuing their study of it. But this is unavoidable seeing that the experience on which the Lankavatara discourses is not within the reach of a consciousness ordinarily suffocated with contrary notions. The sutra is quite explicit in this respect as it declares that those who are tied to words do not understand the truth, or that the superior state of self-realization is beyond speech and analysis. In fact, in this sutra the Buddha is never tired of repeatedly reminding us of the fact that language falls far too short of adequately representing the true state of self-realization. This is in the nature of language. Language is always discriminative. When we make reference to anything, it is to be distinguished from other things, thus limiting it to that extent and to that degree. But the supreme moment of self-realization is not subject to any form of limitation and discrimination. Perhaps the only way of describing it will be to say that, or abstractly, thusness, but even this is discriminating, and distorts the conception. As long as we are what we are, tied up to the exigencies of material existence and to the inherent needs of logical thinking, language is inevitable, and if we do not use words we have to resort to gestures and movements of some parts of the body in one way or another. As the Lankavatara remarks, words are not necessarily used all over the world for the communication of ideas or feelings. For in some other Buddha lands the Buddha teaching is carried out by mere gazing, or by the contraction of the facial muscles, or by the raising of the eyebrows, by frowning or smiling, by clearing the throat, by the twinkling of an eye, by merely thinking, or by a motion of some kind. Articulate speech is not an absolute necessity for human intercourse. Mere gazing is said to be sufficient in the world of Samantabhadra to make one realize the highest state of enlightenment known as Anutpadakadharmakshanti. Even in this world, says the sutra, the ordinary business of life is carried on most successfully among the bees or ants that never use words. If so, we never need wonder at those Zen masters who merely raise a finger or utter an unintelligible cry in order to demonstrate the profoundest experience ever attainable by human consciousness. When there is nothing in my mind which can readily respond to or which is already awakened to take in what is flashed out from another mind. The latter may use the finest expression possible in our language, and yet my mind may remain perfectly blind to its truth. If, on the other hand, there is a chord of harmony between the two, a touch on either side will create a reverberation in the other. There is no power in a language as such, though we cannot dispense with it by any means. The Lankavatara here makes a distinction between words and meaning, and advises us not to understand meaning by merely depending upon words, to do which is quite ruinous to the comprehension of reality. A word is the combination of sound and syllable, subject to our logical or intellectual understanding. It issues from the cavity of the mouth between the teeth, jaws, palate, tongue, and lips, when one is engaged in conversation. Inflections, conjugations, and other grammatical and rhetorical modifications are effected according to the errors and innate desires of the speaker. As to meaning, it is an inner perception itself gained in self-realization when one entering upon the path of Nirvana causes a revulsion in the deepest recesses of consciousness known as Alayavijnana. To gain this inner perception, a man retires into a solitary spot all by himself, and, by applying himself assiduously to abstract meditations and deep reflections, his inner sense or self-knowledge begins to shine out from underneath the residual accumulation of T. B. past thoughts, affections, and deeds since time immemorial. The meaning. Artha, thus realized in one's inmost consciousness, is something no combination of the physical organs is capable of expressing in any way adequate to the experience. But as when searching for an object in the dark one has to rely on a lantern, meaning is after all to be gathered by means of words, at least it is to be thus oriented. The understanding of the relation thus existing between Ruta and Artha will be necessary when we wish to know the nature of the inner perception. This relation between words and meaning, or between syllables and reality, or between teaching and truth, is like that between the finger and the moon. The finger is needed to point out the moon, but it ought not to be taken for the latter. The same disastrous result follows from regarding Akshara, or Ruta, or Dasena as the reality itself. Those who are not able to take their eyes away from the fingertip will never realize the ultimate truth of things. It is again like feeding the baby with uncooked food, it will be too late to resuscitate it when it has succumbed to the mother's unwise treatment. Those trained in the Buddhist doctrine ought to be quite discriminating in this respect. Naturally, we would not know what the teaching of the Buddha was if we had had no communication in words.